Thank you, John, and good evening, everybody. And it's a great pleasure, actually, to take an active part in these meetings rather than sort of sitting at the back taking notes. As John said, this is very much the topic of the moment. And when I was president of the institution two and a bit years ago, the thing I found was that every conversation I had, whether it was within the UK or more widely, people asked me my opinion on net zero, and I knew a little bit about it, but not a huge amount. So what I did, in fact, was I set about trying to understand the subject much more deeply, and I've helped the institution set out its own approach, which is built around 7 or 8 challenges, which I'll mention later on. And I originally gave this lecture alongside a lady, Professor Emily Shuckborough, who's the head of the climate research group at Cambridge University. So she described what was happening in the climate, and I went through the engineering solutions to that particular problem. And my thoughts are in this presentation, which I've updated. I've tried to do it on a fairly factual and rather unemotional sort of basis. I'm not trying to sort of blame anybody for anything, this type of thing, and I'm perfectly prepared to change my mind if I learn something. And also the other point I would make, which relates to my own background, I suppose, is that I look at these things not just from a purely technical perspective, but I think the sort of commercial realities of what's going on are as strong a driving force as the sort of technical possibilities. So, there's a nice picture of some wind turbines. The world that we live in is built around fossil fuels, so coal, oil and natural gas. And we consume about 15 gigatons, that's 15 billion tons of the stuff each year. So that's about 2 tons for every person on the planet. And we're actually living off the energy that was stored in those fossil fuels, I think about 200 million years ago through photosynthesis. So we're burning that off rather quickly, more quickly than it was formed. And of course, to meet the climate objectives that have been set for 2050, we need to switch to low carbon sources. And what I would say to my engineering colleagues is that this is the biggest single engineering project ever attempted or undertaken by mankind. And for example, it requires funding on a quite unprecedented scale. The numbers aren't terribly exact, but a figure of 200 or 250 trillion dollars has been mentioned, which is about 6 or 7%, I think, of the world GDP. So that's how much we need to spend over that time period to get the result that we're looking for. And so what I'll do is I've done the introduction now. So I'll say a little bit about climate change and the political response to it, about how energy flows through the system, because this subject is all about the management of energy. I'll talk about decarbonisation technologies and energy generation, transmission and usage, then some whole system issues, and finally the progress that we're making and the challenges that we still face. So first of all, I hope you don't mind, I tend to rattle off terms like megawatt hours and terawatt hours and so on without thinking about it. So just a quick reminder of units of measurement. So an old-fashioned torch bulb, as you know, will be sort of 1 watt or thereabouts approximately. A kilowatt, it would be a 1 bar electric fire, 2 kilowatts for a kettle or an iron, something like that. And kilowatt hours, of course, that's running 1 kilowatt for 1 hour, is the way we pay for our electricity. So, we will debate the merits of 7p a kilowatt hour from Octopus versus 30p a kilowatt hour from Scottish Power, or whatever company you choose to support. Megawatts, we're talking. That is how electricity is traded in wholesale terms. But 1 megawatt is equivalent to, for example, a 4-car train of the type that goes through Romsey, roughly. And the smallest wind turbines are about 2 megawatts. Then when you get to gigawatts, you're talking big stuff. a large-ish city will consume about a gigawatt of power. I don't think anyone talks about gigawatt hours, or maybe a little bit. And then the next one up is terawatt hours, terawatts or terawatt hours. And if you're talking about the energy consumption of a country, you would express it normally in terawatt hours. So the UK, for example, gets through about 1,500 terawatt hours a year. So you can work that back to how many light bulbs, how many torch bulbs that is. That's too difficult for me. So I'll probably use these units without thinking about it. So let's say a little bit about climate change. This is a graph which shows concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for the last 800,000 years. It's taken from ice samples and whatnot. And if you trace across, you probably can't see the detail at the back, but it oscillates up and down, and typically between about 160, 170 parts per million at the lowest point, up to just under 300. And that was the sort of natural cycle until we got to about 1850. And those of you at the front can see it's now sort of much further up the scale, and it's quite anomalous. And that, in a nutshell, is the problem we're facing. At the present moment, the atmospheric concentration is about 420 parts per million. So it's not all that much. It's only 0.04%. And in a room of this sort, there's probably about a cubic metre of carbon dioxide, but it does have a very powerful effect. And that, in a nutshell, is the issue we're dealing with. And to take that a bit further, I spoke earlier about the consumption of fossil fuels. Well, this is how much greenhouse gas emission the world produces per year. So 15 billion gigatons of fossil fuel produces just over 50 billion gigatons of greenhouse gases. And this is a summation, actually, of the effect of predominantly half a dozen different gases. And you can see that in 1850 we weren't producing all that much, a bit, and now we're up to just over the 50 mark. If you're an optimist and look at the last 5 years, you would say it's sort of flattening out a bit, but it is still going up, I'm afraid. In the case of the UK, and in fact in the case of most advanced countries, things have come down quite substantially. So in about 1990, we as a country were producing about 450 million tonnes of greenhouse gases, and we're down around the 400 million mark now. So our emissions have gone down quite substantially, and the trend is continuing to go downwards. And these are measured, by the way, in carbon dioxide equivalents. And the climate effect, this graph shows you from 1880 through to 2020. You can see the shape of the graph, and it zigzags up and down a little bit. But in broad terms, we're about 1.4, 1.5 degrees C warmer than we were in pre-industrial times. And in terms of what is a greenhouse gas, or what are the greenhouse gases, basically it's 6 which are defined in the greenhouse gas protocol. So there's carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and 3 other fluorinated hydrocarbons. And these are sort of aggregated. They all have slightly different effects and have different sort of residence times within the atmosphere. And these are all aggregated up to I think it's 100-year CO2 equivalents. So the figures are a bit of it's a bit of an approximation, but you can see the general effect. And one thing you might find interesting is that this subject of the effect of carbon dioxide on temperatures shouldn't come as a surprise to us. I've got a copy of a paper which was published in April 1896 by the Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius. And he's called On the Influence of Carbonic Acid in the Air Upon the Temperature of the Ground. And in those days they talked about carbonic acid rather than carbon dioxide. And he gave a surprisingly accurate estimate of the way things were going at the time, what the effect would be. And it was the order of, I think in his calculation, he thought it would have an effect of about 3 or 4 degrees. So that is what 130 years ago in approximate terms. And in political terms, as you know, this whole system is overseen by the United Nations and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is actually a legally binding treaty, which had its origins in 1997 in Kyoto. There are these annual meetings called COPs, Conference of the Parties. The real breakthrough came at COP21 in Paris in 2015, where everyone committed to trying to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, but sort of accepting 2. And then in Glasgow in 2021, at COP26, the Paris stuff was written into what's called the Paris Agreement Rulebook. And I actually, because it was in Glasgow, I did go to that particular conference, which was quite interesting actually. And the term that's shorthand that's used is net zero, which is not one I particularly favour, but it is easy to use. And what the United Nations says about net zero is that, put simply, net zero means cutting greenhouse gas emissions to as close as zero as possible, with any remaining emissions reabsorbed from the atmosphere by oceans and forests, for instance. It sort of hints that you can not only put gas CO2 out there, but you can sort of take it back somehow. But that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny terribly well, at least in my opinion. And this is more of an opinion now. So that's the political background to what's going on. In terms of where do those gases come from or go to, I don't know whether you can see this at the back of the room, but this is a plot of the greenhouse gas emissions in 2019, so it's a bit out of date. And at that time, 30% of them came from coal, and were used predominantly in coal-fired power plants, but also in blast furnaces, chemical processes, and other industrial processes. So at that time, and it's not changed that radically, coal was quite a big component. Gas was producing about 14% of the world's energy. Again, gas-fired power plants, building heating, and other industrial uses, that type of thing. Oil, about a quarter, 25%, mainly for transport for cars, aircraft, ocean freight, and road freight, but also for various industrial uses in building heating and fuel for agriculture. And then this is when you get into slightly more surprising things. About 17% of the carbon dioxide was coming from land use, or first of all, net deforestation, so taking trees out, enteric fermentation of cattle, sheep, and so on, nitrous oxide emissions from the production of nitrogen for fertilizers, and rice and manure. So there's quite a big component from the way that we use land. And then there's a miscellany of things of what are leaks, fugitive emissions is the technical term for them, waste, cement manufacture is a big producer of carbon dioxide, and fluorochemicals. So it's quite a complicated picture, and all those different sources need attention. Just to sort of summarize the UK, this is the energy that we consumed in the UK in 2023. Over the course of the year, we were consuming energy at a rate of 180 gigawatts at any one time, of which 35 is electricity. And I think it sometimes comes as a surprise to people to find that only about 20% of our energy usage actually flows through electricity. Most of the rest comes either from natural gas or from oil. So the natural gas is the blue on there, and the oil is the orange bit. So that's the way that we use energy. And as I say, there is a big concentration on electricity, whereas other things like oil and gas, do need at least equal attention. Again, this is the same thing shown in a different way. On the left-hand side are the different sources of energy, measured in terawatts, my favourite unit. So on the left you see natural gas, nuclear, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, other renewables, biosources, and liquid fuels. So that's the sources coming in, and it flows across. This is known as a Sankey diagram, by the way. I didn't know that until fairly recently, but it's a pictorial way of describing what happens. And by the way, Sankey was a former president of the IMechE. Again, something I didn't know, so I hope you're impressed. And on the right-hand side are the points of consumption, so residential, industrial, commercial, road and rail, electricity, aviation, and losses. If you just look at the colours, the shape and size, and visualise those, natural gas is blue, electricity is red, and oil is grey. And those are the actual figures for 2023. This is a projection for the UK for 2050. These scenarios are put together by the National Grid on an annual basis. And you can see on the left-hand side, natural gas has gone down to very little. Most of it is coming from nuclear, wind, solar, other renewables, biosource, and there's a bit at the bottom which is residual oil. And then you can see that most of it sort of flows across, most of it being delivered through electricity, some potentially via hydrogen, into the same uses as I mentioned before. So that's the sort of approximate shape and size of what it could look like in 25 years' time. On the other thing which doesn't appear on a graph like this is that there is an assumption that our energy consumption will reduce by about a quarter. So that's sort of built in. And that's the assumption. Yes. In terms of the technologies that are available to us, there's quite a lot, and they're quite well developed. I mean, obviously, reduction of energy consumption is, by whatever means, is vital. And actually, in the UK, we have made surprising amount of progress with things like gas boilers and automotive efficiency and aircraft efficiency over the last sort of 30 or 40 years. And my career, I guess, if there's been one sort of continuous theme, it has been energy efficiency. I didn't realise it at the time, but that was very much a driving force behind a lot of the things that I've been involved in personally. Then the other technologies are the generation of energy by renewable means, electrification, the potential use of synthetic or bio-liquid fuels, new methods of producing steel and cement. There's the possibility of using gaseous fuels like hydrogen or even ammonia, and then finally carbon capture and storage. So those are the technologies which to a greater or lesser extent will get employed over the next 25 years and are being employed now. So in terms of, and again I'm talking about the UK here, if you look at the plans that are laid out for the UK, they envisage increasing wind and solar capacity by somewhere between a factor of 5 and 8. So we seem to see a lot of wind turbines, but that's nothing compared with what's needed. Nuclear capacity, the plans are to increase it. The government's stated plans are to increase it by a factor of 4. But the lead times on nuclear plants are very long, and we need to get cracking on that very quickly. The use of bioenergy, so rather than using fossil fuels, using biomaterials that are produced currently, that really is rather limited by availability and competition with other forms of land use for food production, for example. So I think it's unlikely that will change very much. And then I think that gas-powered power plants will need to be retained with carbon capture and storage to provide what's called dispatchable power. So this is a term that's used quite extensively in the electricity generation and supply industry. And what this means is that, for example, if you're watching the World Cup football, you can almost guarantee at half time the electricity demand in the UK will jump up by about 1.5 or 2 gigawatts. And you need something you can switch on, to do that. And in terms of current technology, gas-powered power stations are the only real way of doing that. So although the sort of politicians wriggle a little bit, I think it's unlikely that we'll in the medium term not be able to use gas power plants. In terms of transmission, the electricity grid will be required to transmit at least double the energy and over much longer distances. The map at the top shows some of the offshore wind farm connections. The way that electricity is generated at the moment, it is done quite locally. So, for example, the power plant at Marchwood, is on the fringes of Southampton. So its electricity is going to Southampton, and it's not coming from the Shetland Islands or somewhere like that. So there's a big change which attracts a lot of is attracting more and more attention about the electricity grid. And also interconnectors between the UK and other countries, which is the bottom map shows the connectors that we have between ourselves and Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland and Ireland and France. And those are used quite extensively on a daily basis and current flowing in both directions. Then there is the possibility of producing liquid hydrocarbon fuels as substitutes for normal petroleum by either from biomaterial or synthetically, rather than from fossil sources. And the aviation industry, for example, is very much hanging its hat on what's called sustainable aviation fuels. You may see this term SAF bandied about. And it is also probable that liquid fuels will continue to be needed for heavy duty transportation and for shipping and so on. But the costs of producing it, although it's technically feasible, and there are plenty of examples of it, it is very expensive to produce. And then finally, you may also hear quite a lot about the use of hydrogen for what are termed hard to electrify applications, again such as heavy duty transportation. And hydrogen is produced in quite large quantities already. There's about 100 million tonnes of it produced a year, but it's produced by reforming methane, and one of the unfortunate byproducts of that is carbon dioxide. And there is, I have to tell you, there's very little green hydrogen about. If you find some, let me know. So hydrogen is spoken about quite a lot. I think it sounds quite attractive somehow, doesn't it? It sounds as though an easy solution. You just stick it down the same pipes and so on. But I think it's a bit unlikely, particularly for home heating and things of that sort. But those are the means by which you can transmit energy. And then in terms of energy usage technology, well, we already know that passenger cars are doing quite well in terms of battery power and so on. And it seems to become almost the de facto solution. For other forms of transport, I did work in the commercial vehicle industry for quite a while for Leyland Trucks, and one of the sort of interesting things for me is that I've noticed that other than the very heavy duty trucks, batteries are actually making quite good progress when it comes to commercial transport. It is possible to use hydrogen fuel cells, and there are all sorts of other ways of powering heavy-duty vehicles. I mean, there are 2 or 3 experimental stretches of motorways fitted with pantographs, so that the vehicles can actually pick up electricity as they go along. There's an example in Sweden and a couple in Germany, or vice versa. Then housing and commercial buildings and infrastructure are a big area, big unknown. They account for somewhere between 25 and 40% of total energy usage, and that's split fairly evenly between the actual running of buildings and their construction. So in that instance, there's a fine balance to be struck between how much new do you do, what do you do with old buildings, and retrofitting is a big subject that needs progress. And as I say, steel manufacture is one of the most energy intensive processes. It's been with us since the Iron Age. We still use carbon to take the oxygen out of iron oxide ore, and that produces about 8% of the world's CO2 emissions. There are solutions using hydrogen, and they're on a reasonable scale, but there's a long way to go in terms of producing iron by those means. And cement production is very similar. The natural process of producing cement also produces a lot of carbon dioxide, and that also produces about 8% of the world's greenhouse gases. Then there's talk about negative emissions technologies. This is where it gets a bit more dicey in my view. And the idea of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it's perfectly possible technically. There's a picture of a system. I thought it was in Iceland, but that doesn't look like Iceland in the background, does it? But there are methods of doing it, but it uses a huge amount of water and a huge amount of energy. This is just capturing it, as it were, from the open atmosphere. There are companies, you can actually buy carbon removal, but the price per ton is enormous. You'll see, what I should have said actually is, I should have prefaced this by saying that the carbon capture and storage on power plants, cement plants, and to a lesser extent steel plants is quite a well-developed technology, and I think it'll play quite a big part, certainly over the next 30 or 40 years. At the moment, the world has about 50 million tons of capacity for carbon removal and injection into old oil wells. And if you look at the projects that are in the pipeline at the present moment, that capacity is going to grow to about somewhere between 300 and 500 million tons by 2030 or thereabouts. So, and at that point, it starts to make quite a significant impact. You'll find that other sort of acronyms are used. There is a power plant in the UK in Yorkshire on the Humber at Drax, which uses wood as the source. So it is renewable energy, and there's plans to put carbon capture on the back of that. And you'll see these acronyms. I can't remember what BECS stands for: biological energy and carbon capture and storage, I think. So you get two goes at it. You're using non-fossil fuels to start with, and then you're taking the CO2 away. And then I've talked about direct capture. And as I say, there are about 20 small-scale projects running globally at the present moment. Tree planting gets a mention, and it is actually part of the UK plan. What's been recommended by the Climate Change Committee is that we increase, or we reforest somewhere between 30 and 50,000 hectares of land each year to absorb more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But it's a very small proportion of the UK land area. The total land area is about 25 million hectares. And actually, if you do the sums, what you find is that to absorb the UK's carbon dioxide by trees, you need about twice the area of the UK to do it in. So I don't think that's going to quite work somehow. But deforestation is a big issue globally. It's a big political issue, and it's equivalent, as I said earlier, to about 3 gigatons per year, about 5 or 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. And then there is a series of sort of what I describe as whole system issues. One of the biggest and one of the ones that attracts a lot of attention is the variability of a lot of renewable energy sources. So, if the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, etc. Really, storage is needed to overcome that. And it's interesting, if you look at this current month, there's an app that shows you at any one point in time how much, what the sources are for electricity. And this one is for this current month, January. The orange bit at the bottom is nuclear, which stays fairly steady. The red bit is gas-fired power stations, and the green bit is wind. And you will see on January the 1st there was plenty of wind about, and therefore the gas power stations weren't running very hard. But if you look at yesterday, there was almost no wind, and that was made up. So we have, at the moment, we have this sort of balancing going on between the two. And it's another reason why I think that it's going to be quite some time before we can get away from using dispatchable power sources such as gas-powered power stations. Storage is quite a big issue. There are, within the UK, we have 2 or 3 quite significant storage systems in Wales and in Scotland, which provide about 2 gigawatts of power, and it's quite an efficient process. Pumping it up and down again, you don't lose a lot of energy in the process. And there's about 2 gigawatts there, but the general reckoning is that you need about 20 to 25 gigawatts to balance out the variability of renewable sources. Then there's the whole business of materials. So our world is built around iron and copper and materials of that sort, whereas in the future it's still copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and some of the rare earth metals. And they're often found in places which aren't particularly politically stable. Most cobalt comes from the so-called Democratic Republic of Congo, which I think is not very democratic at all. Carbon dioxide gets most of the attention, but methane is estimated to have produced maybe up as much as half of the temperature rise over the last 150 years. So that is getting more attention. I've spoken about embodied carbon in buildings, and the final thing I would say is that for companies that want to have an impact, there is actually quite a good system for managing and certifying the plans of organisations. And this breaks down emissions into 3 groups, so that scopes 1, 2 and 3, you may see some publicity about this. Scope 1 being the emissions that are produced by the company in the course of its actions, if you like, so the heat for their buildings or their processes. Scope 2 is predominantly the greenhouse gas produced by the electricity or energy provided by someone else to the company. And scope 3, which is a difficult one, is the energy that is used, or the greenhouse gas that's produced in the use of the products that the company produces. And there are quite good accounting systems in place and certification processes for which there are many hundreds or many thousands of companies actually signed up now. My impression is that the companies who are most interested are the ones who can actually manage things. And if you're a gas producing company, it's a bit tricky. There's not much you can do about it. But it is a helpful way forward, and it is quite a rigorous way of doing it. So I think it's quite an important point. Then let's talk about economics. So the world, as we know, operates largely on free market principles. History shows that people will buy new technologies when they're affordable and useful and so on, when they cross that sort of affordability threshold. And governments have also consistently found that they can't sort of buck the market, as Margaret Thatcher once says, and that's very true. And as I said before, huge investment is needed to make the changeover. But most of the technologies already exist, but not at the scale that we require. And that scale, either in terms of the installed base, whether that's solar power or wind turbines or whatever, or in terms of the manufacturing capacity to produce those things. And I think most of the estimates suggest that we're running at about somewhere between a third and a half the level that we need to achieve the 2050 objectives. One of the things that I see in some of the things I'm involved in is that, first of all, there isn't actually a shortage of money. There's plenty of cash in the world. What we do tend to be short of is good investments. A lot of that money is ours. It's our pension schemes and so on. And people don't really like it if your pension disappears because it's been put in an unwise investment. A lot of the investment houses have quite conservative, with a small c, investment criteria. So I think first of all, there is an issue in creating projects which give a good return. And secondly, I think that governments aren't playing as strong a role as they could do. And that leads on to one of the most sort of critical subjects, really. Governments are quite happy subsidising early stage technology investment, for example. And that doesn't, for example, contravene any of the sort of free market principles and so on of our country and the EU, and can act as guarantor of early investments and so on. And the UK actually has been quite strong in underwriting markets with what are called cap and floor mechanisms, which allow people to bid with less risk into electricity markets, for example. But I think the area that is quite weak, and this is throughout the world, is that we don't actually put a price, we don't put an adequate price on carbon. And if we were to tax carbon emissions at, rather than the sort of £40 a tonne that is the current case in the UK, if it was more like 120 or 150 pounds a tonne, you would then open up a whole new range of investment possibilities where companies or organisations would invest to avoid having to pay those taxes. This is a difficult subject because if you do start putting heavy taxes on things, prices go up. And I think that there's quite a lot still to be done in this area. Everything that sort of affects behaviours, whether it's behaviour of organisations or behaviour of individuals. I don't think many governments will get very far if we started rationing holidays to, France or Spain or something like that. But somehow or other, this 25% energy reduction that I mentioned earlier, it's got to be achieved by one means or another. So I think there is a difficult role for governments and politicians to play, and almost impossible one. So in terms of where we are, in terms of the climate itself, as I've said, the emissions of greenhouse gases are still going up. Genuinely, when you look at the numbers, it is starting to flatten out, but they are still going up. There's been quite a lot of high-level political progress with the Paris Agreement and things of that sort, and quite a lot of countries have got net zero targets, including, of course, the UK. And technology-wise, there are a lot of the building blocks are there. In fact, most of the building blocks, but there are also quite a lot of other technologies which are sort of queuing up. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the so-called technology readiness levels, but this is a system for categorizing the maturity of new technologies. And there's quite a lot of technology at TRL 6 and 7, which is just before industrialization. Then on the whole system approach, there are gaps, and I don't think we're addressing adequately the intermittency of renewable power sources. And as I said, the flow of funds is about half of what's required. And these are the 7 challenges which I suggested that our institution and other institutions might like to turn their attention to. And I'm going over the same ground here. Intermittency, intelligent grid. The grids like electricity grids like ours were set up in a way where there were tens or maybe low hundreds of power sources and millions of consumers. And of course what we have now is millions of producers as well. So the intelligence and the two-way flows in the grid take quite a bit of effort. Then there is the role and the scale of hydrogen. What role will it really play? There's the supplies and the availability and the geopolitics of critical materials. Carbon capture and utilisation, heating and retrofitting buildings, and the financing role played by governments. Actually, to the credit of the institutions, that you will find papers, I think, on all these subjects if you look hard enough, with the possible exception of the last one, which I'm doing some work on with some people at the moment, actually. So watch this space. So that's those are the challenges that I believe we face. So where are we? Well, we've got 25 years to switch from fossil fuel to renewable energy sources, and I do think the political, financial, commercial, and engineering world do need to work together much more closely on this. It's one of the things I say to engineers. It's a route which is full of contradictions and ambiguities and uncertainties and so on, which most engineers don't thank me for saying. You know, certainty is the watchword of our trade, if you like. And there are non-optimal solutions. There are things, you know, we can't get it 100% right 100% of the time, as it were. But having said that, success in overcoming climate change, I think, will be an immense contribution from engineering to society. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm very happy to take questions.